My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 34, and I live in a high-end apartment in Seattle. Just last year, I walked away after selling my tech startup for $5 million, an amount generous enough to secure a lifetime of comfort without ever lifting a finger again. $5 million sitting untouched in my account. No spouse, no kids. On the surface, it looked like I had unlocked the ultimate version of success. But my father, the space between us is the dark stain spreading across an otherwise perfect story. Robert Caldwell, my father, used to be a respected name in real estate. Then a string of disastrous investments turned him into a resentful, domineering man. Not someone who tried to run my life, someone who tried to manage my money. To him, I've never truly been a son. I've got a walking bank account. This morning, I stood before the mirror, straightening the dark green dress shirt my mother always said suited me best. Today is her birthday, which means the entire family will gather at the old suburban house in San Francisco. Just like every year, I inhaled slowly, bracing myself against that familiar weight pressing on my chest. The dread that creeps in whenever I know I'll have to face my father. The man who has never embraced me, never once asked if I was all right, and has always stared at me like I was nothing more than a vault with legs. And honestly, that's gentler than the reality of my childhood. Back then, he drank heavily, and when alcohol took over, he'd yank me from my room and beat me without explanation or warning. Those moments carved themselves into me like permanent scars, and every encounter with him feels like they split open all over again. I guided my BMW X7 down the tree-lined streets, the afternoon sun flickering across the windshield in golden patterns. I switched on the radio, hoping the music would quiet the storm of thoughts spiraling inside my mind. When I finally stopped in front of the old two-story wooden house, my mother was already waiting by the door, her smile glowing brighter than the daylight. "Ethan, you made it," she said, wrapping me in a tight embrace. The soft trace of her lavender perfume filled the air, and for a moment it felt like it gently eased the ache buried deep inside me. The celebration unfolded in the backyard garden, where delicate lanterns swayed overhead and bright laughter blended effortlessly with the smooth rhythm of jazz drifting through the evening air. My mother, Margaret, naturally became the heart of the gathering. Even at 60, she carried herself with effortless grace, silver hair styled neatly, warm brown eyes glowing with quiet kindness. As I watched her, a wave of gratitude washed over me. No matter how chaotic my world had become, she had always been the steady ground beneath my feet. My father, meanwhile, lingered at the far edge of the garden, a glass of red wine resting in his hand while his icy stare scanned the guests. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, he still carried the air of a refined businessman, yet the curve of his smile always unsettled me. I did my best to keep my distance, engaging in small talk with relatives, but I could feel it, that persistent sensation of his eyes tracking my every movement. "Ethan." His voice cut through the noise just as I reached for a slice of cake at the buffet table. I turned to find him stepping toward me, holding a glass of deep crimson wine that caught the light. "Share a drink with your father, son. I had this one prepared especially for you." He lingered on the word especially, a thin smirk tugging at his lips that made my stomach tighten. I accepted the glass, my hand wrapping around it a little too firmly. "Thank you, father," I replied, steadying my tone. A few steps away, my mother was laughing with Aunt Susan, and the last thing I wanted was to alarm her. I lifted the glass and took a measured sip. The wine tasted full-bodied, faintly bitter, nothing out of the ordinary. My gaze shifted back to him. He gave a subtle nod, as though checking something off a list. Within minutes, a strange dizziness crept over me. The garden lights blurred into hazy streaks, and the joyful chatter around me began to sound distant, like echoes bouncing from far away. My pulse started racing. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was slowly being drained from my lungs. "Mom," I breathed out softly, attempting to move toward her, but my legs refused to cooperate. My balance gave way, and the wine glass slipped from my hand, crashing onto the grass below. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the old bed in the upstairs bedroom. A dull ache pounded inside my skull, and every ounce of energy felt stripped from my body. My mother sat beside me, gripping my hands tightly, her eyes swollen and rimmed with red. "Ethan, are you all right? Oh God, you terrified me." Her voice quivered like someone who had just escaped a nightmare. "What happened?" I muttered, struggling to gather my thoughts. Then it all flooded back. The crimson wine, my father's unsettling smile, the sudden wave of dizziness. I searched my mother's face for clarity, but she simply shook her head and brushed her fingers through my hair the way she used to when I was little. "You fainted in the garden. Your father claimed you'd had too much to drink, but I know that's not true. You only had one glass, didn't you?" Her worried eyes locked onto mine. I gave a faint nod, my throat painfully dry. One glass, just a single drink handed to me by my father. I tightened my hold on her hand and felt the slight tremor in her fingers. The room was eerily quiet, broken only by the steady ticking of the wall clock. I wanted to comfort her, to ease the fear clouding her face, but I was lost in my own storm of uncertainty. That wine, his cold expression, the way my strength had vanished, it all felt like fragments of a puzzle that refused to come together. "Ethan, I'm really scared," my mother whispered, lowering her voice as though someone outside might be listening. She slowly rose, walked to the window, and stared out at the garden where I had collapsed. "What you experienced, the spinning head, the struggle to breathe, passing out, I've witnessed it before. It was exactly the same with my father." I froze, my pulse hammering in my chest. "Grandfather," I managed to say, my voice unsteady. I had only seen him a handful of times as a child. A tall man with a thunderous laugh that filled the room. Mom always told me he passed away suddenly when she was still young. "A heart attack." That's what she'd said. She turned toward me again, eyes swollen and shining, fingers intertwined so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together by force. "Yes, my father collapsed just like that," she said quietly. "It happened after an evening of drinking with friends. He was perfectly healthy, Ethan, strong, no sickness, no warning, and the next morning, he never woke up." Her voice shook, each sentence dragged up from grief she had buried years ago. I rose from the bed and stepped closer, resting my hand gently on her shoulder. "Mom, I don't think it was a medical condition." The suspicion that had been clawing at my mind felt dangerous to say out loud, but the mixture of fear and desperate hope in her eyes pushed me forward. "You know I go for routine checkups. My heart is fine, my blood work is clean, there's no trace of any inherited illness." Her eyes widened, as though a horrifying possibility had just surfaced. "Then, what are you saying?" she whispered, her voice barely more than air. I drew in a slow breath, feeling as if I were standing at the edge of something dark and irreversible. "Mom, I think there was something in the wine Dad handed me." The words fell between us heavily. She staggered back a step, her hand flying to her mouth as the color drained from her face. "Ethan, how can you even say that? Robert is your father." Pain laced her tone, yet beneath it I saw something else, uncertainty. "I know," I replied carefully, steadying myself. "But didn't you notice the way he kept repeating that the glass was special?" I took that sip, and moments later I was on the ground. I wasn't intoxicated, Mom. It was barely a mouthful. I stopped, holding her gaze so she could see I meant every word. "You felt it was off too, didn't you? Dad claimed I'd overdone it. But you knew that wasn't true." My mother slowly lowered herself into a chair, her shaking hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She didn't speak at first, yet the conflict inside her was clear. The devotion to her husband battling fiercely against the instinct to protect her son. "I don't want to think that way," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "But you're right. Something didn't sit well with me. Your father kept saying you were drunk, but when I looked at you, I knew you weren't." Silence settled over us, heavy and suffocating, like we were two exhausted souls stranded in the middle of a storm with no clear path out. I reached for her hand and held it firmly. "Mom," I said quietly, but with resolve, "I'm going to find out what really happened. I don't want to doubt Dad," I said quietly, "but I have to uncover what really happened." She gave a small nod, tears gathering along her lashes. "Be cautious, Ethan. And if you're right about this, I won't let anyone harm you." When I stepped out of the house, a strange mix of comfort and heaviness settled over me. My mother believed me, at least enough to question things, and that both strengthened and burdened me. Even allowing suspicion to touch my father's name felt like watching a fracture spread through the very base of our family. I drove back to Seattle, determination blazing inside me after that conversation. No matter how dark or frightening the truth might be, I was going to uncover it. Yet in the days that followed, it felt as though I were balancing on a thin wire, every step unsteady. The doubts surrounding my father followed me everywhere, persistent and silent, but I had nothing concrete to hold on to. Just that single glass of wine, his calculated smile, and the unmistakable sense that I had come terrifyingly close to dying. Part of me wanted to bury it, to convince myself it was paranoia. But whenever I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw it clearly in my own eyes, the restless look of someone who knows something isn't right and refuses to ignore it. Then Thanksgiving arrived, carrying November's sharp, unforgiving chill with it. My phone rang, and it was my mother. Her tone was soft, yet there was a fragile hope woven into it. "Ethan, will you come home for dinner? Just for one night." Every instinct told me to decline, to keep my distance from that house that now felt wrapped in something dark and unspoken. But I couldn't bring myself to hurt her. "I'll be there," I replied, even though the words settled heavily in my chest. By the time I arrived, dusk had swallowed the sky, and the old house glowed faintly, light pouring from the windows like flickering embers. I stepped inside to the rich scent of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie, but the warmth of the meal failed to reach me. My mother embraced me at once, her smile as bright as ever, though the concern in her eyes was impossible to miss. At the head of the dining table sat my father, a glass of red wine resting casually in his hand, his gray suit perfectly tailored as always. He looked up at me, that familiar smirk cutting across his face like a sharpened edge. "Ethan, feeling better after your little incident in the garden?" he asked smoothly. The words sounded polite, but the undertone carried a quiet taunt. I took my seat across from him, schooling my features into calmness. "I'm fine, Father. Thank you." Beneath the table, my fists tightened, nails pressing hard into my skin. Around us, my mother moved back and forth with dishes, her cheerful conversation with Aunt Susan filling the room, but none of it reached me. My attention was locked on him. His eyes never left me, steady, calculating like a hunter patiently watching its target. When the main course was placed on the table, my father slowly rose from his chair and lifted his glass. "To my family, to Thanksgiving," he declared, his eyes fixed directly on mine. Then he extended a glass of red wine toward me, the liquid shimmering beneath the candlelight like freshly spilled blood. "Drink, Ethan, this one's special." That word "special" echoed exactly the way it had on my mother's birthday. My pulse slammed against my ribs, every instinct inside me sounding the alarm. Not again. I wouldn't let it happen twice. I accepted the glass, my hand betraying me with the slightest tremor. My mother had stepped into the kitchen to bring out dessert. My father didn't look away. His stare was sharp, almost daring me. In that instant, I understood. I had to move. I let my napkin slip to the floor and bent down to retrieve it. In one swift, seamless motion, I switched my glass with his. The action took less than a second, invisible to everyone at the table. When I straightened up, my heart was pounding violently, a thin layer of sweat forming at my temples. My father casually lifted the glass, now the one meant for me, and took a generous swallow before turning to speak with Uncle Paul. I wrapped my fingers around the other glass, the one that was now mine, and kept it untouched. Then I waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. Nothing. Doubt began creeping in. Maybe I had let paranoia take control. Maybe I had imagined the threat. But around 45 minutes later, my father's voice suddenly cut off mid-sentence. His hand flew to his chest, his breathing turning strained and uneven. "Robert, what's wrong?" my mother cried, rushing toward him. He swayed, the wine glass slipping from his grasp and exploding against the floor. His other hand clutched at his head, his complexion draining of color. Then he collapsed. My mother's scream pierced the room. The table dissolved into chaos. Aunt Susan fumbled for her phone, shouting for an ambulance. I stood up abruptly, not in shock, not in fear, but because a terrible realization was crystallizing in my mind. Dizziness, shortness of breath, losing consciousness, exactly what had happened to me on my mother's birthday. Exactly how my grandfather had gone, according to her story. "Call an ambulance now," I shouted, though my gaze never left my father. He lay sprawled across the floor, breath shallow, eyes unfocused. Yet for a fleeting second, they locked onto mine, and in them I saw it. Panic, as if he understood precisely what he had just consumed. The paramedics arrived swiftly and carried him out on a stretcher. My mother clung to my hand, sobbing uncontrollably. "Ethan, what is happening? Why is this happening?" I held her tightly, but inside my thoughts were spiraling. If I hadn't switched those glasses, I would be the one lying on that floor. The realization cut through me like a blade. "Mom, I need to take a sample from that glass," I murmured quietly. She stared at me, horror flashing across her face. Yet after a moment she gave a slow, trembling nod. She understood. She was thinking the same thing I was. Once the house emptied, and the chaos faded, I carefully poured some of the remaining wine from my father's glass, the one originally meant for me, into a small vial. I slipped it into my pocket without a word. That night, sleep never came. The image replayed endlessly in my mind. My father collapsing, the fear in his eyes, the deep crimson of the wine. I wasn't wrong. He had tried to end my life, and now I would make sure I could prove it. In the days after Thanksgiving, I moved through life like a man on the run, not from someone chasing me, but from the storm inside my own head. The memory of him hitting the floor, that flicker of panic in his stare, and the tiny vial I kept hidden in my coat weighed on me constantly. Every night I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, questioning my sanity. Was I unraveling, or had I truly stood on the edge of death because of my own father? There was no turning back. I needed answers, even if the truth shattered everything. I reached out to a private laboratory in San Francisco, a discreet facility I'd once heard tech colleagues mention. Mailing the sample was out of the question, far too dangerous, so I drove there myself, the vial resting in my pocket like a concealed explosive. The technician, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a sharp, observant gaze, studied me briefly when I handed it over. "I need this analyzed for anything unusual," I said, steadying my voice. "As quickly as possible." She nodded without prying. 3 days. Those 3 days stretched endlessly, feeling more like 3 years. I returned to my apartment, double-locked the door, and kept the curtains drawn, half expecting my father to appear out of nowhere. Then my mother called. Her voice sounded thin, fragile. "Ethan, your father is improving. The doctors said he went into shock, but they can't determine the cause. Do you know anything?" Her voice wavered, laced with fear, but I couldn't bring myself to reveal the truth. "I'm looking into it, Mom. Don't worry," I said, though inside my chest felt like it was being crushed by dread. I was the one drowning in worry. On the 3rd day, my phone rang. The technician's voice was crisp, professional, but there was an edge of urgency I couldn't miss. "Mr. Caldwell, we have the results. You should come in." I drove to the lab with my heart hammering against my ribs. She handed me the report, pointing to a bolded line that made my stomach drop. "Barbiturate, high concentration. It's a sedative," she explained. "This amount is enough to induce unconsciousness, even death if not treated quickly." I stood frozen, the paper shaking in my hands. Barbiturate. Not alcohol, not illness, not an accident. Someone had intentionally laced my wine, and I knew exactly who. I forced my voice to remain steady. "Thank you, and don't tell anyone about this." She nodded, sympathy softening her gaze. On the drive back, I circled the city streets, unable to calm the storm in my mind. My father, the man who raised me, who I'd once tried to earn approval from despite his coldness. Why? Then it hit me. My wealth, $5 million. No wife, no children. If I died, he would inherit everything. The truth slammed into me like a fist. He didn't just want control over me, he wanted me gone. I parked near the bay, waves crashing against jagged rocks below, the icy wind whipping around me. But I felt nothing except the fire of anger consuming me. My father had attempted to kill me, not once but twice, and if I hadn't switched the glasses on Thanksgiving, I wouldn't be alive to witness it. I clenched the report in my hand, feeling its weight anchor my resolve. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wanted freedom for my mother and for myself. A week later, my father was discharged from the hospital. He appeared frail, but those eyes, sharp, calculating, remained unchanged. My mother urged me to visit, but I knew this wasn't a casual call. I slid the lab report into my coat pocket like a talisman and entered the old house. In the kitchen, my mother stirred tea. "Ethan, you're here," she said, smiling softly, though the sadness in her eyes betrayed her. "Your father's in the living room." I nodded, drawing a deep breath before stepping inside. There he was, seated in his armchair, a glass of wine again, resting in his hand, that familiar smirk stretched across his lips. "Ethan, coming to see your old man. That's considerate of you," he said lightly, though I sensed the fatigue under his practiced tone. "I need to speak with you privately," I said, my voice steady, firm. My mother was busy in the kitchen, out of earshot. He raised an eyebrow, motioning for me to sit. I didn't. Instead, I drew the lab report from my coat and set it squarely on the table before him. "Barbiturate," I said, my gaze locking onto his. "In the wine you gave me on Thanksgiving. A dose enough to kill. Explain." His expression stiffened, but he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Poison? Ethan, you've lost your mind." "Don't lie," I cut in, voice as cold and sharp as ice. "I switched the glasses. That's why you collapsed. Not me. I have proof. The lab confirmed it. If you don't confess, I'm taking this to the police." For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Panic, fleeting but undeniable. Silence hung thick in the room, broken only by the ticking clock and the measured sound of my father's breathing. Then, as if a dam had burst, he sank forward, hands clutching his face. "Ethan, forgive me," he whispered, voice cracking. I only meant to knock you out. I was going to forge a will, take your money. I'm drowning in debt, Ethan. I saw no other way." I stood frozen, staring at the man who had once been my father, now reduced to a hollow, desperate figure. His confession struck me like a blade, yet instead of rage, only a profound, aching sadness settled in my chest. "Why, Dad?" My voice was raw, hoarse. "I'm your son." He offered no words, only bowed his head as tears traced lines down his cheeks. My mind turned to my mother, the years she'd endured with him, the life she had lived in quiet suffering. Part of me wanted to call the police, to make him pay, but I knew doing so would shatter her completely. "I won't call the police," I said, my voice quivering, "but from now on, stay away from me, and don't ever touch Mom." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving him in that cold, silent room. As I stepped out, I saw my mother in the doorway, eyes red, her hands gripping the frame. She had heard everything. I pulled her close, feeling her tremble against me. "Ethan," she whispered, and then fell silent. No words were needed. I knew at that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. I left the living room, leaving my father slumped like a shattered statue, his confession echoing endlessly in my mind. Each word pressed into me like a new wound. Confronting him had not brought relief, only a heavy, unrelenting ache. As I moved down the hallway, struggling to steady myself, I caught sight of my mother at the kitchen doorway again, her hands clinging to the frame, face pale. "Ethan." Her voice trembled, eyes brimming with unshed tears. I froze, realizing she had heard it all. The confrontation, my father's confession, everything, it hung between us like a storm. I moved toward my mother and wrapped her tightly in my arms, feeling her tremble against me. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, as though she were the one to blame. "I never imagined Robert could do this." I led her out to the garden, where the lanterns from her birthday still cast a faint, warm glow. We settled onto the wooden bench, the quiet only interrupted by the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. I held her hand, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she exhaled slowly, her voice stronger than before. "Ethan, I heard everything. What your father admitted. I can hardly believe it, but there's something I need to tell you." Her eyes, heavy with pain yet resolute, met mine. "The symptoms you had on my birthday, they mirrored exactly what happened to my father. He collapsed after an evening of drinking with Robert." She hesitated, summoning the courage to continue. "He died soon after. Everyone claimed it was a heart attack, but I always found it suspicious. He was healthy, with no illnesses. And after his death, Robert inherited nearly all of my family's fortune. My blood ran ice cold. "You think Dad had something to do with Grandpa's death?" I asked, voice low. She nodded, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I didn't want to believe it, Ethan. I loved your father. I wanted to trust him. But now, I fear I've been living with a monster." Her words cut through me, stripping away every last fragment of denial. I held her tighter, letting our grief merge. "Mom," I said firmly, "if you're right, we have to uncover the truth. Not just for me, but for Grandpa, and for you." She sniffled, brushing away her tears. "I'll help you, Ethan. No matter what comes, I want to know the truth too." We remained on the bench beneath the faint glow of the moon, mother and son bound by a new understanding, united in a struggle neither of us could have imagined. I felt the weight of what lay ahead, yet fear had loosened its grip. With her by my side, I felt ready to confront whatever came. The following day, we began our search for the truth. Words were few. We moved like soldiers in a silent campaign. I suggested starting with the safe in my father's study, where he stored his most important papers. My mother nodded, though I could see her hands tremble as she reached for the door. "I haven't been here for years," she murmured. Robert never liked me touching his things. The safe loomed in the corner, an unyielding block of steel. My mother recalled the combination, their wedding date, a detail that twisted painfully in my chest. Inside, we discovered real estate documents, contracts, and an old, worn, leather-bound notebook. "This was my father's journal," my mother whispered, fingers shaking as she opened it. The delicate scrolled handwriting revealed my grandfather's final days. One entry froze us both. "Robert's behavior is strange. Last night, after a glass of wine, I felt dizzy, short of breath. I suspect he intended to harm me. If something happens to me, investigate." We stared at one another, silence heavy between us. My grandfather's words, preserved in ink, confirmed our darkest suspicions. "Mom, we need professionals," I said. I reached out to a private investigator, Mr. Harris, a man who had assisted a friend during a complicated lawsuit, and a criminal lawyer, Anna, whose expertise could guide us legally. Both agreed to help. Harris recommended exhuming my grandfather's autopsy report. If poison was involved, he explained, traces could remain even after all these years. With Anna's guidance, we secured a court order, ready to dig into the past to uncover the truth. The exhumation was painstaking, but the final revelation struck like a thunderclap. My grandfather's autopsy confirmed what we had feared. He had been poisoned with a sedative closely related to barbiturate. It wasn't a heart attack. It wasn't natural. We pressed further. Harris unearthed forged papers in my father's inheritance records, signatures that didn't match, irregular transfer agreements, documents that screamed deception. Each discovery was another brick in a wall closing in on my father. My mother sat beside me, reading each page, her expression hardening with every line. "I lived with him for over 30 years, she whispered, voice breaking. "And I knew nothing, Ethan." I squeezed her hand. "It's not your fault. He deceived both of us." But the grief in her eyes was tempered by something fiercer, a burning resolve. She was no longer the timid, obedient wife. She was a mother, a daughter of justice awakened. "I'll sue him," she said, her voice unflinching, as solid as stone. "Not just for you, for my father. Robert will pay." I had never seen her this fierce. Together with Anna and Harris, we assembled our case. The thick file contained the lab report from the wine, my grandfather's journal, the autopsy report, and the forged documents. Every page cut like a knife into my father's past. The trial arrived on a gray, rain-soaked morning. I sat beside my mother, holding her hand, feeling the chill of her fingers. My father took the stand, diminished, no longer the domineering man I had known. His eyes were hollow, his composure brittle. "I didn't do anything," he murmured, voice weak, almost pathetic. But the evidence was irrefutable. Anna presented it all with precision. The wine laced with barbiturate, the clear intent to kill me, my grandfather's journal, the autopsy confirming poison, and the forged documents showing how he had eliminated my grandfather to claim the family fortune. Each revelation left him more exposed, a man stripped of power, finally facing the consequences of his crimes. The prosecutor called my mother to the stand. She rose with quiet strength, her voice steady as she recounted the decades spent under a manipulative husband and the unbearable pain of discovering he had murdered her father. I watched her, my chest swelling with pride, tinged with sorrow. My father didn't stand a chance. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Guilty. Attempted murder for me. First-degree murder for my grandfather. Life in prison without parole. As the officers led him away, he glanced at us one last time, empty eyes devoid of remorse. I felt no victory, only a hollow where our family had once been. After the trial, my mother moved in with me in San Francisco. The old house was sold, a final closing of that dark chapter. Free from my father's manipulation, she discovered peace. She tended her lavender garden, and every afternoon we shared tea, speaking of small, quiet joys. One evening, as the sun painted the garden gold, I turned to her. "Are you okay, Mom?" She smiled, squeezing my hand gently. "I'm okay, Ethan. Justice has been done. Your father can no longer harm anyone, and you're safe. That's enough for me." I felt a calm settle over me as well. Though the scars my father left would never completely fade, I continued my work, living now for these simple moments with my mother. Beneath the soft glow of the sunset, I knew we had finally stepped out of the darkness together. If this part of the journey touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story, your strength, your perspective might help someone else who's still walking through their own storm. And if you believe in healing, resilience, and the power of family bonds, make sure to subscribe to A Father's Wrath and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next powerful story. We're building a space where truth is spoken, lessons are learned, and hearts grow stronger. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.